Um, I just want to thank you all, first of all, very sincerely for taking time out of your valuable time to come and discuss these topics with us. Um, the topics for today's discussion are, I have my document here, are the wholeness, completeness, and concreteness of God and the essential concepts which underlie Christian apostolic succession and the Vedic disciplic succession. And we have the four of us gathered here today. Two are coming from the Christian tradition and two are coming from the Vedic Vaishnava tradition. And I'd like to just start with some introductions before we get into the dialogue. I'll start. My name is Krishna Keshavadas. I'm here from the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute, a nonprofit educational organization in Princeton, New Jersey. Our serving director and my guru, Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj, who I've learned everything from, and I'll be drawing on what I've learned from him during today's dialogue. If Professor Clooney, if you'd like to go next.
Okay, so I am a Francis X Clooney, Francis Xavier Clooney. Francis Xavier was the first Jesuit to go to India in 1542, so I'm in that lineage, Society of Jesus. I've been a Jesuit for 55 years now, and went to India first in 1973. So this is the 50th anniversary of my first trip to India and Nepal. I have the traditional Catholic training in theology for ordination as a priest. And I also have a PhD from University of Chicago in South Asian languages and civilization, work with Sanskrit and Tamil materials of various sorts, and then comparative Hindu Catholic studies. I taught at a Catholic university, Boston College, for 21 years, and I've been at Harvard since 2005.
Wonderful. Professor Schweig, would you like to go?
Sure. Yeah, Graham Schweig here. Where to begin? I've been, really a practicing bhakta since about the same amount of years. Frank, he spoke 55 years. I mean, that's about right for me. About 51 years ago, I should tell everyone here that I'm a high school dropout. It's embarrassing, but I think you should know that at the start. I dropped out, but I dropped in to Johns Hopkins for undergraduate work. And then I dropped out after the third year and went to India and found myself in Vrindavan on Janmashtami Eve without realizing it was Janmashtami. So my path has really taken some twists and turns along the way as a practitioner, but also as an academically trained person. So my journey really began by reading Bhagavad Gita at age 14, and I never stopped. So that's been the start of my journey. But then I received training. I graduated from American University. I returned to American. I went to University of Chicago, entered into a doctoral program there, but then switched over to Harvard for a master's degree. And then I came back to Chicago, but then got distracted by a Smithsonian-funded grant where I would live in India for a year. And then I came back to Harvard to finish up with a doctorate there in comparative religion. So since I graduated, I taught at Duke University for 2 years, and then at Christopher Newport University in 2000 for the last 22 years, Virginia's newest university in the public system. Since 2017, I've been teaching master's and doctoral students at Graduate Theological Union, teaching courses there. And oh gosh, what can I say more? I think that's about it. I think I'm sure other things may come up, but yeah.
It's very wonderful to have you here, Professor Schwartz. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Yeah.
And Henry, my good friend Henry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Henry Bert. I'm a third-year PhD student at Princeton Theological Seminary in the Department of Pastoral Theology.
Hmm.
And apart from my studies, but also related to my studies. I pastor Lutheran churches in the Diocese of New Jersey, the Synod of New Jersey, I should say. I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church. That's why I use the term diocese. And um, at the seminary, I guess, I'm drawn to a particular thinker named William James, who writes a lot of just about the psychology of religion, coming from, of course, a Protestant and a Puritan home life. He still took a great interest in many other world religions, including Buddhism. During my time here in Princeton, I've gotten to know Krishna Keshava Das and the Bhakti Vedanta Institute at the YMCA, where I am a member and partake in their monthly prasadam. And Krishna Keshava Das and I have had a similar talks amongst ourselves, a couple of lectures, but I'm just happy to be a part of the continuing conversation.
As our first two dialogues, the first topic was on some universal principles of religion, and then the natural follow-up to that was actually a topic recommended by Henry on Twiceborn from some of his own readings from James. And I was eager to talk on that because from the Vedic side, the whole idea of Dvija or Dvijanma, Twiceborn, is also very prevalent. So that was a great segue to another talk. And if you look at the recording to that second talk, some of these ideas that we're talking about today, especially the concreteness and wholeness of God, were inspired by something Henry was saying about that there is something called systems or process theology, I believe, and how some people think that, God is a process of becoming, and there are different thoughts on that. Some think that God is not yet complete, but in a process of becoming complete. And, so we thought it would be a great topic to discuss here today. And also from that same dialogue, the second dialogue, we briefly mentioned this apostolic succession and the disciplic succession of Vedic idea. So we thought we'd discuss that. And actually, Professor Clooney was kind enough to give us some encouragement after seeing the first dialogue, which we shared with the Society of Hindu Christian Studies mailing list, which I only came to know actually through Professor Schwartz. He recently was in contact with my Siksha Guru, Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj again, and he shared his CV, and I took a look at it, and I saw that Hindu Christian Society, and I thought, hey, this would be a great place to share these dialogues that Henry and I've had. So unknowingly, actually, all of you have had a big part in the progress of this dialogue. So it's I think incredibly auspicious and very very encouraging to have us all here together to have a further discussion. So now this is not a formal kind of dialogue where we have a set time for each person to speak. It's very organic, very open. So just I'll repeat the topics again, and essentially it's open. Whoever would like to start, please feel free. So the topics are the wholeness, completeness, and concreteness of God, and the essential concepts which underlie Christian apostolic succession and the Vedic disciplic succession.
And then, Krishna, in your email to me the other day, you mentioned the third topic, our conception of spiritual progress. So is that off the table now, or is that on the table? Or?
Like I tried to explain in one of my follow-up emails, if it comes up naturally in the progression of these first two, I think it would be good to talk about, but we don't have to necessarily insert it right now.
Okay.
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to me, and I'm sure Frank is very familiar with this passage from the Upanishads, the Purnam Ada Purnamidam, Purnat Purnam Udachyate, Purnasya Purnam Adaya Purnam Eva Vashishyate. And this is, I mean, you talk about wholeness. I mean, the Upanishads, the ancient Upanishads, which are the dialogues between teachers and students in thousands of years ago, this famous invocation appears in front of several, I think a few different Upanishads, if I'm not mistaken, at least a couple. So it's the Om Purnam Ada Purnamidam. So wholeness, Purnam, fullness, completeness is there. It is there. Ada. So wholeness somehow is containing everything, but yet it's over there. Wholeness is also here. Purnam idam. Purnat purnam udachyate. From wholeness, wholeness comes. And then purnasya, purnam adaya. From wholeness, when wholeness is taken, wholeness even so completely remains. So, I mean, that's just the first thing that comes to my mind when you speak of this. The Upanishads celebrate wholeness, and especially in this invocational verse.
Sure. And that's, amongst living entities, we see that especially, of course, where one person, right, comes from another whole person. Tree comes from a whole tree, etc. So these wholes, which are incredibly complex in themselves, are only coming from another whole, which may be, contrary to perhaps a popular idea of scientific reductionism, where some assembly of parts is the same as the whole, and that's very prevalent to what the Bhaktivedanta Institute is working with. How we never observe such a thing. We never observe that you take the parts of an organism in an isolated way, and then you can put them back together and you have the whole organism, right? That is never the case. That has never been done even once. A whole can only come from a whole. A life can only come from a life. So in this individual way, Om Purnamada Purnamidam, as Professor Shrag is saying, it's very wonderful. And sometimes in the Vedic scriptures, we're also seeing the example of a candlelight to communicate the idea of that the whole does not diminish when another whole is taken from it, or is produced from it, not taken, but when another whole is produced from it. With a candle, we can understand so many other candlelights can come from a single candlelight, and that original candlelight doesn't dwindle because so many other candlelights have been, produced from that.
Yeah, just to start off on my side, or my perspective, I was thinking about this in terms of two sources. And the first would be, unsurprisingly, the Bible itself. And I think, in the varied and very poetic and historically rooted language of the Hebrew Bible, there are all kinds of images, not necessarily all coherent with one another, of God as source, God as Father, God as that from which everything comes, God is the sovereign being beyond question, the greatest, the wisest, the all-powerful. And I think that is very powerful. I would say my perception is for Jews, and certainly for Christians, and certainly for Catholic Christians, in terms of this superlative figure. It's sometimes put in terms of combative terms, in terms of God who is the God of all gods, or God than whom there is no God greater. This sovereignty of God that comes to the fore. That terminology could be explored in so many places in the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament, I think those claims are sustained in terms of some of the language in the letters of St. Paul, and in the Gospels themselves, about the sovereignty of God, God the Father, whence whom all comes. In the beginning was God. All of that echoes very well, but with the further claim that the completeness of God is not added to, or is not added to by claiming this about Jesus Christ as well, that the presence of God in the world, the embodiment of God in Jesus Christ, is a true kind of, I think, Krishna, you were saying, kind of an overflowing of the original source, which eternally was the Father and the Son, and then becomes the Father, the Son, and the Son who descends into the world. And that in some mysterious way, to see Jesus is to see the fullness of God in the flesh, even in flesh that can be broken, that can be crucified, and so forth. So I think all of that is in the basic imagery and symbols of Christian tradition. Henry may have another perspective on this. The only thing I would add is that and this is can hardly be added briefly, but I will be as brief as possible. Then the early Christian contact with Greek thought and the models, particularly of Aristotle and Plato in various ways that I'm not totally the master of, using Greek terminology of being with a capital B, of the unmoved mover, of the source, as a way of expressing in a more cosmopolitan fashion outside the Hebrew world and the world of Palestine and Israel, this perfection of God language. And then by the time you get to the so-called High Middle Ages, where saints, from Augustine up to Anselm, Bonaventure, and perhaps most notably Thomas Aquinas, the systematization of the language about God, who is complete and perfect in God's own self, and is the pure act of being, and that God is not an essence, is not a dravya or a thing of some sort, but rather is a very active being in some powerful existential sense. And then people like Aquinas, using the Greek thought, will then try to show that is compatible with the language of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But I think there's kind of a staunch digging in there about God is, in a sense, and this wouldn't undercut later developments necessarily, but God is not in process. God is the fullness of being already. God is perfect, and that all categories point to the superlative nature of the divine person. And trying to hold this in terms of Greek philosophy, which obviously was not about the God of Israel, and the God of Israel terminology, which in some ways tries to accommodate the language of the Greeks, but certainly therefore affirming the wholeness and completeness, and for the Christian in Jesus Christ, the concreteness of God in the world as possible and not impossible. But I'll stop there for now, but that's a vast amount in a short time.
Well, I think in the work that I particularly do, both in a parish setting and then also in my writing, and even in clinical senses with hospital chaplaincy, um, I found that it's been very important to have my own, especially seminary education about the nature of God, theology, Christology, soteriology. Um, but taking it a step further to really take a curiosity in who people need God to be for them in that particular moment. Um, so I guess I kind of approach sort of a conversation like this, not so much in a sense to provide answers, but to, I think, as somebody like Hans Gadamer, a philosopher, would say, create a horizon of understandings, to bring in my perspectives of God, to meet with perspectives of God of other people, to create, and then in the words of William James, a pragmatic sense of who God can be. I think there are some people in a particular life circumstance where they need to believe in a God that can be all encompassing and bear their grief. Other times they need to think about a very um, carnal, down to earth God, especially in the person of Jesus Christ, that takes on brokenness and even um, in a way, I think uplifts brokenness as a being in the world, and how God really seeks to honor that. I think there's a lot of paradox that goes with talking about God in this way, in a way that we really can understand God to be both infinite and limited, and especially that comes down to sort of Trinitarian perspectives too. But again, I think what I'm looking to do in my work is really, I think, creating narrative and building narrative off of traditional narratives, but also personal narratives, and sort of being co-creators of just who God is. And I think that kind of is part and parcel of really what process theology speaks to. Is it allows for a theology that can be reinvented and reimagined while still maintaining tradition. And I think that's a hard thing
Hmm.
for people to really um, come to terms with, is how can something be reinvented while still being respected as a tradition? I think that's the age-old question of Christianity, as we talk about apostolic succession too, a tradition that generates itself across generations.
I would actually like to just point this important distinction out, I think, that has arisen. So much has been said already. But as so in the Bhaktivedanta Institute's work, obviously this is the work that Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj has been doing for the last 50 years. Basically, the heart of the work is seeing things from not only a Vedic perspective, but from a Western philosophical perspective, from the work of Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, a German philosopher, because we find actually much commonality between the two in the metaphysical outlook, especially of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, called Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva, simultaneously, inconceivably one and different, which is, basically a more harmonious perspective from a metaphysical view that's either monistic or non-dualistic or dualistic, where you have like these polarities, either one or the other is considered the truth, and the wholeness of both oneness and the multiplicity is not conceived together. We also find this idea in Hegel's dialectic approach. So in Hegel's philosophy, he points out these three perspectives um, of being, So of being for self, being in itself, and then being for consciousness. So being in itself, being for self, and being for consciousness. So when we're talking about God, we're talking about the infinite, and we are the finite. The being for consciousness of the finite, of the infinite, for the finite means, how does the infinite appear to the finite? Being for consciousness. Now, that's not yet talking about being in itself, what the infinite is in itself, independent of the consciousness of the finite. So being for the consciousness of the finite has a very limited view of what God is from this level of what I'm talking about. And the reason I'm saying this is Henry was saying how he, in his work, working directly with people going through life circumstances, looking for the shelter of God in specific ways based on their life circumstances. To me, this is approaching being for consciousness of God, what the finite entities in their certain circumstances are looking for God to be for them. That's being for consciousness. And that's very important, but it's distinct from being in itself and being for itself of God, where through what is largely called revealed knowledge, scriptural knowledge, we may consider that as how traditionally people come to know the being in itself and for itself of God. through what has been revealed from the infinite revealing itself to the finite. Some people have these kind of ideas. So I just wanted to make that distinction before we move forward. I hope that was clear in what I'm saying.
Mhm.
I'm very interested in what Henry was speaking about, and you, Krishna Keshava, you're bringing up. Well, there's so many different topics, but when you bring up Achintya Bheda, which is a kind of ontologic, it's sort of a metaphysics of a Vedantic formula, but when translated experientially, and this is where I think the bhakti tradition can be very meaningful in terms of a pastoral context. It's about experiencing the otherness of God, being apart from God, and simultaneously feeling oneself, experiencing oneself as a part of God. So apartness and a part of and apart from, both at the same time. And so on the one hand, one thing I tried to point out in the Bhagavad Gita is that essentially yoga means the return embrace of a divinity who is already in its wholeness, embracing everything and all of us. So this return embrace is I think, something that potentially can be very comforting in an ultimate sense, in a pastoral context.
Mm-hmm.
That that the miraculousness of just existence and everything that is provided. I just had that experience eating an orange this morning. Who arranged that? Something so tasty and so beautiful as an orange. I mean, now I've had dozens of oranges throughout my life. I'm not a young man, so I've had plenty of oranges. But suddenly, an orange is just kind of speaking to me this morning for some reason. I don't know why, but just the miraculousness of it all is potentially overwhelming. So it's better that we all study books and so on, so we can forget about the overwhelming miraculousness of it all, which is the wholeness. But I think that William James, what a classic, and William James lived right behind the Center for the Study of World Religions, where Frank's office is. I think still.
Mhm.
I think your office
Yes,
is still there.
definitely there.
So
I can see the giant William James building from my desk as I'm sitting here right now.
Yeah, that's not as pretty, but his little house,
His little house, yeah.
a block away,
Yeah.
and I used to live right there at the Center for the Study of World Religions. And, William James, I mean, he is just a classic. I mean, right, Frank? I mean, people just keep going back to him.
Yeah, we have the annual William James lecture. It's an old lecture series, and every year there's somebody in to talk about the riches and ideas of James.
So he's alive and well,
Yeah. I mean, I would add, sort of supporting what Henry was saying, but I think echoing is that I think, so I'm here, from a Roman Catholic tradition, but I think we've learned over the generations that there are different languages and discourses that are not all the same, but that we need to be able to philosophize. We need to be able to have somewhat abstract notions of the divine. We also have our scriptural traditions to which we are obliged and need to deal with the metaphors, the poetry, and the like. And we have to be able to then bring it to people, both in their, in worship, preaching, and so forth, and also in the individual needs. I had the Mass this morning, and then we're in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. So we're in chapter 5 of the Gospel according to Matthew, piece by piece, week by week. And we had a discussion after Mass today about part of chapter 5. But one section that culminates this chapter, I'll just read to you a small section from chapter 5. You have heard it said in the past that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then the key part is why? So that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Mm.
And I think that there's a nice mix there of language of moral challenge to change the way we relate to one another, to let there be an overflowing love in every context, and to be like God, and this sense that shows up elsewhere in scriptures, both East and West. The sun shines on everyone. God is, you might say, equanimous, somewhat toward all beings. The rain, the sun, the giving of life to all beings. And then Jesus's, gentle but amazing challenge at the end: God is perfect, therefore you be perfect. And it doesn't have to do with being eternal in the Catholic tradition, at least, but the sense of this being in union with God, being filled with the Spirit of God, and then overflowing with God's reckless, indiscriminate love for other beings. Then, Henry, I think that can be translated, or needs to be translated, into ways that actually help people when they're in trouble and so on. So the perfection of God is not like an irrelevant, abstract point for theologians to debate. And then we have to worry about pastoral practice. But these are connected discourses, because being perfect is to be overflowing of the good. And that goodness is needed in a broken world where there's so much hatred and enmity.
Yeah, beautiful. There's Frank, you spoke about the overflowing love from God to humans. I think in Bhakti context, we learn that the Bhakta's heart is to overflow with love for all beings and for God. So I think it's a strange kind of river. It's got a flow going one way and a flow going the other way. Mm-hmm. And Krishna says in the Gita these beautiful few words: "Anityam asukam lokam imam prapya bhajaswamam." Having come to this impermanent, unhappy world, offer your love to me. Offer your love to me. Mm. And I like to scare my university students a little bit. They're young, and they're thinking about these things. And I tell them what I think they're going to ask themselves when they're on their deathbeds. This may be cruel pedagogy. I don't know. I don't know, Frank, if you've ever done this, but, and Henry, you may end up doing this. Who knows? But I tell them all, I said, I think on your deathbed, you're going to ask yourself, have I loved much and have I loved well? If you can answer in the affirmative, I think you could just, wither away very nicely. Mm. But, I think that if the heart is empty, if the heart is somehow, disconnected from that love that you talk about, Frank, then what is the point of it all? What is the point? Mm-hmm. Have we loved much and have we loved well? I really think that's I think that's what it's all about.
Very true.
Professor Clooney, I just want to first acknowledge you have very clearly tried to get back to several of the overarching topics. And I want to return to what you said about 15 minutes ago at the end, where you said that the incarnation of Christ was necessary. Or please correct me if I'm wrong. You said that the incarnation of Christ in the world, as God in the world, was necessary or is necessary for that wholeness of God.
And well, I think it's the kind of thing, again, if you go into someone like Thomas Aquinas, they would say it's fitting and it's appropriate. It's not necessary in the sense that it's sort of, well, obviously this will happen, or God cannot be God unless this happens. But for the Christian belief, the incarnation is a gift, and God so loved the world that God sent God's only Son into the world. Is a matter of wonder and miracle. But then in retrospectively, this is entirely in keeping with God, who is love and who is always overflowing in love. The overflowing of the love is manifest in the incarnation. But it wasn't necessary in any kind of logical sense or mechanical sense. But I guess you didn't mean that anyway. So
Sure. And so obviously in Vedic thought also, the incarnations of God are coming for the same reason. To, when human society by its own devices becomes in such an overwhelmingly miserable condition, essentially, then God descends to reinstate the connection of love between the finite and the infinite in personal way, the most intimate way possible. Specifically, right, in the Bhagavad Vedanta tradition, the Vedanta, which is the culmination of Vedic knowledge. Right? Vedic knowledge has a lot of material knowledge, but it culminates in what is the material for? It's for to develop spiritual life ultimately. So Vedanta is the end of knowledge, the end of Veda. And now there's and again, so that's described in the Vedanta Sutra or the Brahma Sutra by Veda Vyas, who is understood to be an incarnation of God also. But now there's many interpretations of Vedanta, from non-dualism to dualism to what we were speaking of before, Chintya Beta, Beta Tattva, this dialectic idea. And so that dialectic idea is connected with Bhagavat Vedanta, Bhagavat meaning Bhagavan, Supreme Personality. Because the other traditions, especially Advaita Vedanta, personality is seen as it is an illusion. So any kind of personal expression of an incarnation, that is a lesser thing, seen as a lesser thing in Advaita Vedanta. And unfortunately, the world sees Indic thought as Advaita Vedanta in general, which is unfortunate because the wealth of Vedic thought is actually more in this Bhagavat idea, that there is not only the oneness of God, but the differentiation as many finite personalities and as the infinite personality in the incarnations of God itself. So this idea of personality in the incarnation is very important. And this idea of personality, which establishes the parampara system, the disciplic succession, because God is not only coming to just love the world in general, but to establish a very specific kind of love, a specific kind of love where the finite beings come to see themselves as necessarily dependent on the infinite personality. So once this knowledge is taught by an incarnation of God, and this comes in Bhagavad Gita when Krishna comes to discuss it with Arjuna during the Battle of Kurukshetra, and during that discussion he tells, I came many thousands of years ago to talk with the sun god, and that knowledge has been lost in the course of time, so now I'm coming to reinstate that knowledge. And then in Gaudiya Vaishnavism we find Sri Krishna Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also coming for this specific time, place, and circumstance, or the specific yuga, to give the specific activity and method for cultivating this kind of love. So in between the incarnations of God, the succession of disciples is there to carry on that knowledge in a living way from heart to heart. And in the Vedic perspective, that is of the utmost importance to continue the bona fide or pure connection with God through the disciplic succession, through the acharyas. So I'm wondering what kind of idea is there from the apostolic succession, carrying on the message of Christ, or even before Christ, or what? I don't know about that, and I'm very curious to know about what that is.
Well, I could speak a little bit to that. I mean, I tread a couple of traditions within the Protestant church, Lutheran and Episcopalian mostly. And it wasn't until I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church as a freshman in high school that I realized, I think, the importance of church authority in sort of the succession of bestowing power and even just general rights of the church, rights as in rights, the bishop is present at a confirmation to um, fulfill a laying on of hands. And that comes from the Bible, with an apostolic laying on of hands, to especially when it comes to leadership, as the Holy Spirit being passed on, so that the person that has been uh, laid hands on it can go out and do the work of a Christly authority figure. And the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church at that too are very high liturgical denominations. So other Protestant denominations might have a different viewpoint of that. But if you kind of then take a look at the Lutheran Church, Martin Luther especially was, in his context, really looking at sort of the accessibility of the church and even church authority, to a more broad population. And he has a term for it, the priesthood of all believers, which for Luther meant that, sort of the equal footing of all specific church functions. The pastor might have one specific role, and in Lutheran polity, we say that is to preach the gospel, and to administer sacraments. But there are a whole other variety of church functions that go on, and Luther was very skeptical of sort of an exclusion of, would you even say, apostolic succession that can only be passed down through, I think, heirs or specific elites of the church.
Thank you, Henry, for that. I would add to it. I think it's complicated when we begin to look into, you might say, from the outside at the history of the church.
Yeah.
And it's a great diversity across, the Mediterranean world, the churches of the East, also the churches of the West. Then, variety in the forms before the Reformation, and then after the Reformation, all the more diversity. Therefore, one doesn't, I think today, many, if not most, Roman Catholics are very reluctant to assert that the only single way to be Christian is to be Roman Catholic, because that had been an assertion that this is the paradigm and everyone else has to live up to this. But I think there did come to be the sense that there are varieties of ways of being Christian, but for the Catholic tradition, which I think continues even to today, to Pope Francis, the notion of the understanding that, sure, things happened with the Roman Empire. There was kind of an imperial model. The European churches developed in a certain way. There's a certain kind of dominance of Western nations and the Roman Church globally for some time. But that, if you go back to the basics, it's clear that Jesus chose in his ministry women and men to follow him more closely, apostles and disciples, and mandated to them to spread the message, to preach the good news. And that was taken to mean to pass down the tradition. And as you were saying, Henry, I think the tradition not simply as a matter of doctrine, but also practice and ritual, community building. Despite the pomp and circumstance of Rome, one of the more cherished titles of the Pope is servant of the servants of God. And there's ministries of service in the church. So it's very complicated, but I think we on the Catholic side, and I think many of the other churches, are concerned with continuity with the intentions of Jesus in the beginning, and trying to go back to it, to remain faithful to it. I just close by saying that, as you surely know, with Vatican II, the Catholic Church Council in the 1960s, sense that the priesthood is for all the people of God, and that may be a certain ordained ministry, but the idea that only Catholic priests are priests has been put aside, at least except in the most clerical circles, which are subject to clericalism. So there are complications, but some sense of the lineage, the tradition, the parampara of teaching back to the beginning, I think, is important for us. And I think just there are different forms throughout history and how that comes forward.
Well, that's certainly true for Vaishnava traditions, as you know, Frank. I mean, the Sri Sampradaya, the Madhva, Sampradaya, Nimbarka, and the Vishnu Swami or Vallabha Sampradaya. So, I mean, these are. I think there's an energy of tradition that comes through the commentaries, the continued conversations, in the interpretation of scripture and so on. Seems to be very similar. I mean, in many ways. I mean, to my mind, but nonetheless, each tradition, and I mean, it's kind of embarrassing getting a doctorate in comparative religion, because I think I eventually learned that religions are incomparable in certain ways. I mean, so I think it's that there's something unique and special about each tradition that each tradition offers. I mean, when I read, for example, Philippians, that famous passage in Philippians, Frank, of how Jesus, God takes the form, of his son, and a son who goes on the cross, and so on. I mean, this kind of suffering, sacrificing Christ for all humans. I mean, this is unique. It's not. I mean, the Bodhisattva in Buddhism, maybe not really. It's just, I'm hard pressed to find anything as powerful and as poignant in the comforting of humans in their state of suffering, in the human condition. I think in the Vaishnava tradition, the comfort comes from more in a vision of an eternal dance of divine love. And of course, you know where I'm coming from when I say that. So I think that the loving vision of God, both are love, but expressed in very poignant and very powerful ways. And Krishna Keshavaji, you spoke of the Society for Christian and Hindu Studies, Hindu Christian Studies. So in that journal, one of the journal issues, I wrote something about the two, powerful symbols of divine love, the cross and the Ras Mandala, and how different they both are, but yet it boils down to a kind of total love, a total divine love that embraces all humans. And it's so there. I think there is a beta in these kinds of discussions. There's something very resonant and something yet very unique. And I'm talking to the master of comparative religion here, or comparative theology, I should say, comparative theology. So.
Oh, Graham, I think you do pretty well yourself, so I'll give you the title of master.
Okay. But it's just great stuff. I mean, I think it's what we live for in our professions, isn't it? I mean, the vibrancy of this kind of dialogue, the vibrancy of this kind of conversation.
I mean, since the notion of comparative has come up, I think I can't resist adding that, realizing that traditions are incomparable could be not constructive if it's at the starting point saying traditions are not comparable, and therefore let's not compare them, let's not think of them together or learn from them both. But I think you're right, Graham, and I think this is what we would agree on, that as you do your study and as you enter deeply into your own tradition and another tradition, the distinctness, the difference among traditions and the real incomparability comes to the fore.
Yeah, the preciousness. Preciousness.
The first incomparability is kind of flattening, saying, don't do this, stop being a comparativist, we have nothing to learn from each other. But the second one is the grace of appreciating great beauty and specialness of traditions that are not going to be flattened out and said, oh, basically they're all the same or something like that.
Yeah, right. Unless, of course, you're Rudolf Otto, who writes puts the two traditions, Lutheran Christianity, in competition with Sri Vaishnavism.
Yeah.
And of course, Sri Vaishnavism lost the competition, according to
Right. Yeah.
Rudolph. So anyway, but he was an early starter.
I don't know if this is a bibliographical, but I'm sorry if we're wandering here, but the book by Yoshi Sawai, who's
Oh yeah, I knew him.
of the center, he has a wonderful book out on Rudolf Otto. As a Lutheran pastor, as a theologian, as a comparativist, as a scholar of Vaishnavism. Just came out like last year or something.
Oh, I didn't know he came out with that. He was a peer of mine at Harvard at the time.
The book has finally come out, and it's this broad, really assessment of
interesting
his work.
Well, John Carmen used to talk quite a bit about Rudolf Otto.
Yeah.
So
of course,
that's where he probably got it from. Yeah.
I think also one point, as we're saying, the value of compared religions, although on some level they're not comparable. As much as we see each religion from the being of consciousness of the finite, it's hard to compare because we're not looking at the element which is unifying. The element which is unifying the finite is infinite, is God, right? So to the extent that a group of people or an individual understands that there is a supreme being, a supreme personality, which is the context of every other being, of every other personal interaction, and then all these different traditions, all these different ideas are the attempts of the finite to learn how to love the infinite. That in itself is a clear common ground, I think. But it places the emphasis back on the infinite and not so much the finite. And I think that is one of them, from my personal experience from practicing bhakti, that is one thing which has become emphasized for me, which I hadn't considered previously, how to always try to, although of course it's not possible for me to know what the infinite context is in itself, of course, because I'm only finite and I cannot go over that barrier of myself. But to the extent that I see myself as a finite part of the infinite whole, then I can say something about that because I'm talking about my constitutional position as a part of the infinite and seeing the world as also a finite part of that infinite. So I think the more we place the context on God and the different ways to come to know or love God as coming from God's self, then I think that is very progressive and very harmonious when we're coming to these kind of dialogues.
Yes.
I think although I don't do a lot in comparative religion, I always feel comfortable in these conversations because as we talk about, I think just the complexity and just the breadth of God, and especially having that understanding through felt experiences, it just makes sense for me that I could, at least entertain the religious experiences of another, and that those are valid in their own rights. I think we are worshiping beings, but this time and age, it does not really lend itself with all of the technologicalization, screens. I'm reminded of a book from Abraham Maslow back in the 1960s called Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences, where Maslow was writing to both a scientific and a religious community that were at odds with each other. The scientific community could, at least in Maslow's mind, not reconcile religion with such a objective Enlightenment age that we were living in. But Maslow did still think that science and religion could be reconciled. He did it in a great way, especially through psychology. He came up with terms like cognition, that really kind of gets at a thick description of just what makes for sort of a cognition primed to encounter the divine. And he labels those peak experiences. And Maslow would say that the institution of religion as an institutionalized um, uh, uh, corporate entity is for the sake of communicating and articulating and working through the rough process of giving voice to religious experiences.
Mm.
And he thought that was particularly valuable for a whole community that was not really able to engage with that anymore. And you know, I think it's, for one thing, to say people that can be even hostile to religion or concepts of comparative religion. I always have to wonder if that's necessarily because um, they're a bit limited, I think, in just sort of the life experience they've had in terms of encountering, in Otto's words, the numinous or the uncanny, or the almost kind of the fear being uh understanding just the utter magnitude of something way beyond our comprehension.
Mm. Mm. Your institute has the word Vedanta in it, and Frank and I study the Vedanta Sutra quite a bit. In even the Purva Mimamsa as well as the Uttara Mimamsa, and the Vedanta Sutra is very spare, very abstruse sutra texts. But in the last one, I think it's like 500 and there's some 550 sutra texts in there, something like that, right? It's quite large. But the last one is so dramatic, and its drama is expressed in the repetition of its very terse phrase, anavriti shabdat.
We're going to end soon.
Anavriti shabdat. And this.
We won't go until 4:30.
Oh, should I keep going or should I stop?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, Dr. Schwartz. No, please continue.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think we compare to share, not to compete, and in the Ottoan sense. But this last sutra text, Anavriti Shabdat, that we rise above this conditioning, this further turning within the conditioned existence. We rise above it through Shabda, through sound, and I think that may be the core of what is truly what we compare and what we share. Anavriti Shabdat, so powerful. That conclusion, really powerful.
Yeah.
After it dismisses Sankhya, and all kinds of stuff in the beginning. But anyway, yeah.
And I would highlight, the importance, Graham, of what you've just done is reminding us of these texts that are often considered too difficult, too scholastic, too intellectual to be relevant. Texts such as the Brahma Sutras or Uttara Mimamsa Sutras, they're actually, if you begin to understand them, models for what we are still trying to do.
Yes.
So after the first four sutras, which kind of present a model for thinking about Brahman in the world, Brahman knowledge in the world,
right,
and the so much space in the first adhyaya is given to trying to understand what are we talking about,
right,
and the great diversity of Upanishadic texts. Are they talking about Brahman or about individual Purusha or about Indra, whatever? Getting all that straight. And then, as you just said, I mean, the second Adhyaya, reconciling or contrasting this knowledge with that of Sankhya, yoga,
Mhm.
different Buddhist schools, and so on like that.
That's right.
And I think personally that the third and the fourth Adhyaya is maybe the older part because it has to do
Oh,
with reconciling the so-called vidyas, these texts of knowledge from Brihadaranyaka Chandogya in particular, so
mhm.
that we can meditate on them properly and so that we begin to travel the path of ascent toward realization. And I think part of what's going on there is to say, sure, you're not saved by exegesis, you're not saved by your knowledge of Sanskrit, but it really helps the community to have a
Yeah.
clear sense of its sources and how to think about them, what's
Mm.
distinctive about them, so that as practitioners, we can meditate and find our way forward, leading, Graham, as you just said, I mean, to this final point of you finally reach liberation, non-return.
Yeah.
Uh, but
Yeah.
which is it can be accomplished in some other way through devotion, let's say. But the brilliance of the Brahma Sutras is to not be ashamed of the intellectual path
Yeah.
that enables you also to understand the tradition to which you belong. And that's what Badarayan, I think, is trying to do. And Shankara tried to explain Ramanuja, Madhva, Vallabha, and other great acharyas through the centuries.
Mm. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Um, at the founding of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, so on the desire of Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the Bhaktivedanta Institute was founded by Swoop Damodar Das Maharaj. And the idea of bhakti at that time in the public, and even to this day, or it can be said, is a very sentimental idea sometimes. And that things which are like scientific and reasonable based on the progress of intellect or reason somehow are rejected. And the Bhaktivedanta Institute, when it was founded, Srila Prabhupada mentioned this one verse from Bhagavatam. And now I'm forgetting the verse in Sanskrit, but essentially what it said is that this kind of systematic or scientific progressive knowledge of things is coming to know the glory of God and is non-different than kirtan itself. And like I said, I'm forgetting the verse, but kirtan is the process of chanting the glory of God by chanting about the pastimes of God or the names of God. And Srila Prabhupada said that, this kind of scientific systematic approach to not only the goals of religion, but also trying to get a clear idea of what is the goal of science, of truth, of nature. What is the truth of nature? That is not something which is different from spirit, from the goals of religious life. And that, so taking these kind of systematic approaches, which include, of course, the organic, dynamic nature of spirit, which is not rigid and mechanical only, which is the unfortunate downfall of current scientific endeavors. It's strictly mechanical, strictly reductionist. It's limiting the organic, dynamic development of thought. But when those things are holistically included and embraced, and we don't try to limit reason to our argumentative thinking or purely analytic thinking, then we're actually systematically coming to know the glories of God. So chanting the glories of God by coming to know science, the science of religion. So these kind of ideas are central to what the Bhaktivedanta Institute is trying to do. And dialogues like this are incredibly, we're so happy and so thankful to participate in them and to have such qualified and sincere souls as yourself to just come and open-heartedly discuss these things. And it's very inspiring, and we feel very humbled to be here ourselves. So.
Well, it's a wonderful discussion. All the way throughout, I felt this kind of healthy tension between natural theology and what John Macquarie calls symbolic theology. I like that better than dogmatic theology. This kind of movement, and then of course even over to applied theology with what Henry's doing. So we've been kind of moving around the main theologies, sort of, and then of course across traditions. So This is it's always a nice discussion to have. Always a good conversation. Always healthy. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I would echo that, Graham. Yeah, I always feel like I come out of these discussions with that much more of a curiosity and simply put, an appreciation.
Yeah.
So thank you for
Nice.
this.
It's good.
And I think we learn more about the traditions to which we belong in the process by hearing others speak. So, Henry, I'm thinking that, this is an interreligious conversation, but it's also ecumenical.
Yeah.
To hear of, Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic perspectives, which differ, but I think today we realize are complementary and are ways of refracting the same light of Christ, but in different ways that needn't be seen as polemical or one's right and the others are wrong. And I think that's a great achievement. We're not going to be one in the sense that we'll all come to one church on Sunday, but nonetheless, the ability to respect and learn from one another by talking to Hindu interlocutors, I think is a beautiful thing. I've tried occasionally to get like Vaishnavas in the South, Sri Vaishnavas of different schools to talk to one another more by saying, well, here's a Christian talking about the Tengalai, Vadagalai, Vaishnava positions. Don't you realize how much you have in common? So it's an odd way in which interreligious can feed the ecumenical as well as vice versa, the ecumenical opening up into interreligious possibilities. We can't talk to each other in one faith tradition. It makes it harder to talk across the wider conversations as well.
Yeah. Sometimes it's harder to talk to your brothers and sisters in a tradition than it is to speak to others outside the tradition. Yeah.
All those Roman Catholics who are totally wrong and don't agree with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I saw a article in the back of a New Yorker magazine a couple weeks ago. It's called Eat, Pray, Contemplate. And it was a write-up on a new book that's come out that looks at monastic practices and how monastic practices throughout the ages can teach us something about the art of attention. And very early on in the article, there was a portion about how these different forms of monasticism, these different orders even, kept kind of spying on one another, who had the right way of going about practicing attention or somehow rekindling the experiences of Jesus and Mary. And as I was reading this, and I was kind of talking with my advisor about this, he actually sent me the article. So I felt I was obligated to reply. I said, all of this sort of competitiveness, right? What a sort of an apt analogy for current denominational warfare, even, it seems like, especially within the Protestant church, of just having to nail down our way of thinking, particularly, that is the right way of going about things. And I don't know, people might hate me for it, but I just love kind of picking and choosing from all different traditions. I think there's something to be said for that. And I think case in point, having a conversation like this, both on the ecumenical, but on the especially the interfaith dialogue, is just tremendously helpful for me. And I think I wish a lot of my peers, who I have a lot of respect for within my own denomination, would maybe take a step more in branching out too, and engaging in some of these dialogues.
Yeah, I wish that too, from where I'm sitting as well. There will always be people that are more closed and myopic, and those who will be more open and secure enough to share.
May I introduce myself at this point?
Oh,
please.
Madhavapuri Maharaj. Greetings. Greetings.
How are you?
Good.
Then after so many years, huh?
many, many, many moons ago, 1,000 dog years, I think, at least. Yeah.
Yes. And Father Clooney, also my pranam to you.
Namaskar.
And Henry, I've heard about you through Krishna Kesava.
Namaste.
Pranam, namaste. So I was very nice to hear you said about Vedanta. The last word of Vedanta is subjute. Huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, there's maybe controversy about this, but subjute has a very special meaning. Huh? You know that? What is your understanding of subjute?
Yeah. No, Shabda, you're referring to the yeah, okay.
Shabdat.
Right. In the ablative, Shabdat, right? Shabda, right? Yeah.
What is your understanding of that word?
My particular understanding?
Yes.
Well, it can have so many layers. Sound in some basic denotative sense, and connotatively referring to the Vedas, and even further connotatively, revelation, the power of sound to reveal reality.
And
that's just off the top of my head.
Subjute, as I understand from Prabhupada's and Bhaktivinoda Thakur's and Schwartz's comments on it, means the sound that descends. It's a descending sound, and not the sound that we make. It's the sound that is made from the absolute platform and that descends to this world. Descending sound.
As in Revelation, right?
As in Revelation, exactly.
Right.
The meaning of Revelation is what is revealed, is what is already there, but is made known to us. So the truth is not something we have to invent or create.
Right.
Truth is something that we live.
Yes.
That is there always.
Nice.
And our efforts are to expose ourselves, to be exposed to that, to remove the coverings that prevent us from knowing that truth. So when we speak of the different religious viewpoints and different ideas, the thing that is separating our understanding of the truth is only our misconceptions, our ignorance of what is that truth. And these private idiosyncrasies, or whatever you want to call them, that are isolating us from that truth are what are also isolating us from one another. Because the truth is one, you can't have so many different. And to reveal, to be exposed to that truth, in other words, is what is actually the meaning of surrender, sharanagati.
Yeah.
Surrender means to give up all these private ideas. Actually, the mantra, the word mantra, mana atara, means to release the mind. The mind is creating so many different ideas that are not the truth, actually, because it's created by us, by the finite. And the infinite has its own ideas, you could say.
Yes.
Which is one thing I like about the Bhagavad Gita, of all the scriptures in the world, is the song of God. It is God's, if you want to ask, what does God say about everything? What does God say about all of this?
It's the Gita.
To the Bhagavad Gita.
It's his Gita. Yeah.
It's the words of God directly spoken to Arjuna. So we get an idea of what God knows, what he wants. The Gita in the most clear and what would you say, articulate way. Very simple way. So this is Shabda, and emphasizes this. Bhaktivinoda also told in his Dasamula that the Shabda is the most important method of realization.
Yes.
Realization of God. So it is what connects the finite and infinite.
Yes.
This is what connects. And to hear that Shabda is to clear us of all our misconceptions, all the Shabda that we hear, all the so-called sounds that we hear from other places. It's all a creation of this material world. It's created by sound.
Yes. Beautiful.
So all our misconceptions are created by sound, and that those misconceived sounds, or those sounds that lead us to misconception, are clarified by Shabda.
Mm.
They're dissolved by Shabda. And so to be able to hear Shravan, to hear Shabda, to hear the descending words, to hear the words of the saints, or in connection with that Shabda, who don't try on their own to create knowledge, but rather try to receive that knowledge, to expose themselves to that, to let it manifest in their lives.
Mm.
In the 10th chapter, 10th verse of Bhagavad Gita,
Tesham satata yuktanam. Yeah, that's right.
he says, Dadami Buddhi Yoga.
Yeah.
I give you the buddhi, I give you the intelligence, the knowledge by which you can come to me. What is the qualification of that person? They must be Tesham Satata Yuktanam. They're always connected with me, always thinking of me, and Bhajatam Priti Purvaka, and with much love and affection.
Yes.
Bhajatam, praising me, glorifying me. To these people I give Dadami Buddhi Yogam.
Mm.
Yenamam, and then he says, Yenamam Upayanti Te. Now, Sridhar Maharaj gave a very unique interpretation of that upapati or upayanti. He says generally, pati means husband, and upapati means paramour.
Mm.
So not only do you come to me as like a wife comes to a husband with that type of love, but a paramour comes to their husband or a friend. That kind of love Krishna gives to those who practice that process of Tesham Satata. Yuktanam. Yuktanam means yoked to me, or hooked to me.
Right.
And that connection is, of course, a heart connection, a love connection.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the Bhajatam. There's also an activity involved in our part. Bhaja means to worship, devotion. So both these things, remembering, loving God, but also expressing words of love that are based upon love to express our feelings.
Yeah.
Reciprocal feelings between the Lord and his devotees.
Nice. Yeah. So I put in the to chat Ramanuja's comment, part of Ramanuja's comment on that last sutra. Shabdat means. So he, like Shankara before him, sees it as a reference to the Chandogya Upanishad 8:15, and also Bhagavad Gita 8:1, 5 and 6, 5 to 16. And it's a beautiful thing. You can read it in the chat about how the culmination of the life of devotion, of ritual and knowledge leads to this point of non-return, as Chandogya Upanishad says.
Yes.
I think that in the actual Vedanta of Shankara Ramanuja, that's what the Shabdat means. It's these specific texts that come to the fore. And they agree on that. And I think that was what Graham was pointing us to before. There's an agreement basically on that element, that the scriptures assure that if you follow this path, you will come to a state of non-return. And that's a beautiful way to end the sutras.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to bring that in.
Thank you. That's great.
We're going to go soon, and the chat will disappear. But I can send anyone the reference if you like, Henry. If you can't find that, I can send it to you.
I've already copied it.
Okay.
I have too. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I do have to go shortly. I don't know. Krishna, is there more to follow, or are we concluding?
I think we've come to the natural conclusion of the dialogue. So I think I just want to again thank everybody for taking their valuable time to come discuss
Yes.
important topics with much love and respect for each other. And I'd just like to conclude. I'll say a prayer, which is to just basically glorify the sincere seekers seeking love of God. Vanchakalpa Trubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Namaskaram. Yes.
Namaskar.